ever Rosalie Bertel Memorial Lecture. And we're going to start with Aliss Terpstra, who is one of the directors of the International Institute of Concern for Public Health, and she is also a member of the Toronto chapter of the Council of Canadians. The second speaker, Anne Tillman, is also with the International Institute of Concern for Public Health, and she is an expert who teaches at York University and is an expert on the environmental health effects of pollution from mercury, uranium mining, and nuclear fuel production. Together, they will present a talk on the threats of the Great Lakes to the Great Lakes Commons from radioactive pollution and fluoridated water. This is going to be a real barn burner, so take the note.
Good afternoon. I'm very grateful to present with Anna this first ever memorial lecture in honor of Rosalie Bertel, the founder of the International Institute of Concern for Public Health, who died last June at age 83. She left the world a legacy of knowledge on the ethical assessment and compassionate remediation of the biological and public health effects of industrial and radioactive pollution. We're going to address two policy-based pollution threats. Anna will be presenting an overview of the radioactive hotspots studying the Great Lakes Basin, the effects of uranium mining and processing on the environment, the water quality, fish and game, and the health of Indigenous people in the Great Lakes ecosystem were of deep spiritual and ethical, as well as scientific concern to Rosalie, and a great deal of her research came from that concern. But first I'm going to talk about the harmful accumulation of fluoride that is the result of bad law, bad policy, ego, and ignorance. The title of my talk is Water for Daphnia. It's not about a child. It's the name of the genus of tiny round filter feeders known as water fleas. They have a tough outer shell called a carapace. They bob and dive appealingly, and they wave their feathery appendages in feeding. They are keystone organisms in the Great Lakes aquatic food chain, and they are very sensitive bioindicators of fluoride pollution. In the Great Lakes, ambient fluoride level has increased alarmingly due to artificial water fluoridation of municipal drinking water since 1945. When I joined the board of the IICPH in 2003, I heard three things from Rosalie that will stay with me for life. War and the preparations for war cause the worst pollution. We must protect the seeds because the healthy survival of future generations depends on them. And each one of us can and should do more. Rosalie Bertel was a nun, a scientist, teacher, writer, and wonderful friend. She was also a courageous dissident who applied scientific principles to expose the truth about the danger to public health and environment from allowed and approved levels of chemical and radioactive pollutants, including those released from uranium fission to boil water to make the world's most expensive alternating current. When Rosalie left her native Buffalo and settled in Toronto in the early 1980s, it was because her life had been threatened by powerful interests that first tried to dismiss and then disparage and then silence her quiet but authentic voice. Ontario was her home and safe haven for nearly 20 years as she traveled the world doing work on behalf of the institute she founded in 1984. I brought the issue of water fluoridation as an environmental contamination problem to the board of the IICPH after reading a remarkable book by Christopher Bryson called The Fluoride Deception. Bryson had outlined the strange connections between the public health policy of artificial water fluoridation and the official denial of the effects of environmentally destructive and neurotoxic fluoride gases released from secret uranium enrichment facilities producing fissionable material for the building of the first atomic bombs. I wasn't sure if Rosalie would be willing to critically examine the possibility that an acclaimed public health policy was actually a beard for hiding industry pollution and emissions from creating weapons of mass destruction. But Rosalie, as a scientist with an inquiring mind, grasped the many similarities between effects of radiation exposures and effects of increased fluoride intake. The fetus and child are far more vulnerable than adults. There are gender differences in vulnerability. Internal exposures are much worse than external ones, especially for the fetus and child. Large single exposures stimulate repair mechanisms, while chronic low-level exposures result in permeability of cells to heavy metals and other toxins and greater destruction of health. Both radiation and fluoride can cause suffering and harm through endocrine disruptive and developmental effects, with epigenetic changes and harmful consequences in future generations. With both radiation and fluoride, the harm is also done to the environment, the garden, as well as to the individual, the seed. Rosalie, the expert in biometrics, looked at the evidence that fluoride is an endocrine disruptor that causes dental fluorosis in more than half of all children living in the heavily fluoridated Great Lakes Basin. Rosalie, the mathematician, understood that the volume of fluoridated water at 1 part per million entering the Great Lakes in treated municipal effluent each day from multiple points in Ontario and the 7 Great Lakes states is a significant rate of pollution. In fact, it amounts to approximately 1 pound of fluoride per year per person in each fluoridated system since 1945. A conservative estimate is 50 million pounds a year for the last 20 years, and that's cumulative. I'm a child of the Great Lakes Commons. I have lived my whole life in its watershed. My bones and breath are made of this commons, and my children's too. I'm also one of the first generation of children exposed experimentally from conception onwards during the early fluoridation trials conducted in Grand Rapids, Michigan and Brantford, Ontario, begun in 1945. As a result, my siblings and I have too much fluoride stored in our bones. I passed my fluoride body burden down to my children during gestation, so they have too much fluoride as well. And my daughters will download their body burden to their future babies. It bioaccumulates through generations of mothers, like many other persistent pollutants. The Canadian Water Quality Guideline for fluoride in environmental surface fresh water is 120 parts per billion, set to protect the life cycles of aquatic organisms. Adult Daphnia can tolerate more fluoride in water, but their children cannot. The same is apparently true for humans. But fluoridated water is about 1 part per million, at least until recently. The environmental water quality of the Great Lakes and the watershed is the joint responsibility of Canada and the US, except for fluoride. The decision to allow excessive fluoride in municipal discharge entering the lakes is up to the individual municipalities in Ontario and up to each state in the watershed. Minnesota, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York State each have their own fluoridation law, some of which is mandatory and approaching 100%. It contains 50 or 60 million people who are drinking artificially fluoridated water that discharges to the rivers or lakes feeding into the Great Lakes Basin. You can see from Google Earth Maps that this water is all connected. You can't just fluoridate in one area and not affect the whole. You can understand how narrow-minded it is to put the fate of this unique and precious commons in the hands of public health officials who refuse to even acknowledge the science, let alone the arithmetic. The softer the source water, such as in Lake Superior, the more vulnerable Daphnia is to an even lower threshold of fluoride increase, calcium loss, and acidification. That is one reason Thunder Bay declined the province's recommendation to fluoridate, and Windsor recently voted to stop. So there is this huge disconnect between the reality of this science-based environmental limit of 120 parts per billion with its cautions for depletion of calcium and sustainability of species like Daphnia, and the promotion of water fluoridation at a so-called optimal increased level of 700 or more parts per billion with no thought given to the downstream consequences. This increase is advised for all municipal drinking water by federal dental health authorities who apparently don't get that we consume less than 1 out of 99 fluoridated liters and who are not accountable for the resulting fluoride contamination of our source water. Measurements from various points from eastern Lake Superior to Montreal show that levels of fluoride have risen in the upper layers of water compared to levels measured in oldest, slowest moving water in the deeper troughs. Fluoride has been measured at more than double the Canadian Water Quality Guideline in the discharge bottleneck areas such as the Detroit River, Hamilton Harbor, and the Narrows beyond Kingston. It is too high in most shoreline waters. As fluoride accumulates, it binds with free calcium and takes that calcium to the bottom as sediment, making it unavailable to species like Daphnia and fish who need it for scales. Water also loses its buffering capacity against sodium increase, carbon dioxide, and acidification from climate change. But that is slowly starting to change as Quebec and Ontario municipalities are ending fluoridation one after another, and mandatory fluoridation laws are starting to be challenged in the US. Beginning with Rosalie's guidance and strengthened with your support, especially from Maud Barlow, who championed our resolution in 2011, we are going to save the water for Daphnia with better law, wiser policy, and humble awareness. Please help us make unfluoridate a provincial reality. Thank you.